There are now multiple damages assessments out there looking at the climate threat and assessing that threat into the tens of trillions of dollars. There's much that we don't know, but the common level moving into the tens of trillions ought to be a wake-up call for all of us.
Welcome back to Outside Counsel. I'm your host, Jeffrey B. Simon. Today, in the second part of my discussion with author and climate change expert Jeff Goodell, Jeff explains how climate change threatens our very existence and poses dangers that exceed those of nuclear weaponry and illicit fentanyl. A lot of people perceive the urgency of problems in terms of how it affects them directly. And you describe heat as a predatory event, one that calls out the most vulnerable people. But then you observe that will change. As heat waves become more intense and more common, they will become more democratic. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'm very glad you raised that, because one thing that I think anyone who has thought at all about this issues of how heat affects us and the risks of heat understands that certain people are more vulnerable than other people. You feel it's already getting warm here in Texas, and I made the mistake of walking out and going for a walk in the middle of the day the other day in a black t-shirt, and I realized, oh my God, that was a mistake. I am more vulnerable than I would have been if I were in a white t-shirt, because the black absorbs the heat and all that. Similarly, I think everyone can understand that there's a difference between someone who is working in their office in an air-conditioned room and, the guy, and they mostly are guys, that you see, say, out on the interstate laying black asphalt on a 110-degree day in Texas or in Arizona. Similarly, I think many of us understand that if you are older, if you have heart problems, if you have any kind of circulatory problems, things like that, you're more vulnerable to heat events. And so in that sense, heat is predatory. There are people who are weaker and less resilient to heat than others. That includes newborn babies. It includes people on certain kinds of medications and drugs. There's a whole list of things that we could talk about that increase vulnerability to extreme heat. But at the same time, as it gets hotter and hotter, and as we get more deeply into this experience, everyone is going to be vulnerable. I felt that last summer here in Texas when we had 40 days of over 105 degrees, where it felt dangerous to me, just like walking out to my mailbox. It was so hot. And in the midst of that, and in the midst of the publicity tour for this book, and I was at home doing interviews and things like this, our air conditioning failed in the middle of the summer, and we had to live for 10 days without air conditioning when it was just during this extreme heat. And I will tell you, it was not just discomforting, but scary. So there's this notion that it's only going to hurt people that are unlucky enough to be working outside or who have a heart condition or something like that. But that you and me and the people that we know and the people that we watch football games with, or the people that our friends and loved ones are going to be fine because we have air conditioning and we know better. But that's not true, because it's going to affect all of us in all kinds of ways. And one of the ways I tried to communicate that was in the opening chapter of my book. I talked about a family in California in the foothills of the Sierras, 40-ish-year-old man, his wife who was in her late 30s, their 1.5-year-old child, and their dog, who went for a 7-mile hike just not far from their house on a hot day in the summer. They were experienced outdoors people. They had water with them. They hiked to a river where there was water, but then they had to climb out a 2-mile switchback climb on a very steep slope with no shade because there had been a wildfire there. And when they didn't return that night, their friends got worried. And the next morning they called the sheriff, and the sheriff sent out a search party. And the entire family was, including the dog and sadly the child, were dead there on the trail. And they died. It took them about a month and a half to figure out what had happened, but they all died of heat stroke. And they were strong, young, healthy, no pre-existing conditions. They just happened to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, not in a much more dramatic way, but it's not dissimilar to what happened to me on that day when I was walking or running on the streets of Phoenix and felt my heart starting to explode in my chest and getting dizzy and things like that. So that's what I mean, is that as it gets hotter and hotter, if you're stuck, if you have a flat tire on the side of the road and your car breaks down and you're stuck on the side of the road, I don't care how rich you are or how good a shape you're in, you could be dead very quickly from this. And we're getting into the range where the vulnerability is magnified for all of us.
In wealthier countries like the United States, do we have a tendency societally to dismiss or at least ignore extreme heat as a threat that's experienced only by people who live in impoverished nations that lack adequate resources to mitigate heat, like insulated shelter and air conditioning, reliable power, healthcare, and water?
Oh, absolutely. But not only in distant countries, and we have most of us, including myself, to be honest, until I started reporting this book and understanding it better myself, we ignored it in our own towns, in our own cities. I live in Austin. There are thousands of people who live in the city who live in uninsulated, unair conditioned, low income, poorly built homes and apartment buildings and things like that, who are incredibly vulnerable to heat. And like every big American city, significant unhoused population who are extremely vulnerable to extreme heat during the summers here. You don't have to think about what's going on in Bangladesh or somewhere that to find the people that we ignore about this, that we just write off and or look away from. It's happening right around us. When I gave this talk in Wisconsin yesterday, and we're the day before yesterday, someone asked me about, when I was reporting my book, who are the people that I met that I most remember, that I think about the most. And one is this woman that I met in a low income housing in Phoenix who she was in her 60s, not in great health, living alone. And she had these black drapes or blankets over all of her windows and trying to keep the sun out, trying to keep cool. Her apartment was on the 7th or 8th floor. I went there in the summer. It was stiflingly hot. I had a hard time being in there for 20 minutes. And she had an air conditioner, but she had it hooked up to this odd coin mounted system because she didn't have much money. I don't remember now some kind of arrangement with her utility where she could feed in money to this thing. And she every day would have to arbitrage whether she could afford to put in some cooling or whether she could afford to buy dinner for herself or go grocery shopping that week. And those are the people that I think about who are living on this sort of edge and who actually have to make decisions about how much heat they can take and whether they can afford to pay for this luxury of air conditioning. And I think, and obviously, if someone like her guesses wrong and thinks I can make it through the night without putting another $3 worth of coins into this machine to cool me off, she guesses wrong about that. She could end up dead.
To put into focus that this is not just a poor person problem, you observe that when the next pandemic hits, the chances are good it will be caused by a pathogen that leapt from an animal that was seeking a cooler place to live. Can you explain why you believe that's likely?
Animals, just like plants, just like us, we all have what I described earlier as a Goldilocks zone, right? And the sort of range of temperatures that we thrive in. And just like us, if it gets too hot or too cold for that matter, but in this case, we're talking about heat, if it gets outside of that Goldilocks zone, they move. The animals, the plants, the humans moves to find that Goldilocks zone. So frogs are well documented to migrate to higher elevations. All kinds of insects move. Forests move. Northern forests are moving farther north slowly. But one of the things in mosquitoes, of course, which are very mobile, are very sensitive to temperature, and they're moving to new places. And so I talk a lot about it in the book about these vector-borne diseases where mosquitoes are carrying Zika and dengue fever and even malaria into new areas very quickly as they seek their Goldilocks zone. But in relation to the pandemic, what's happening is that you're having animals of all sorts moving into new areas and encountering new animals that they have not encountered before. Bats are a classic example of this moving, and they carry a lot of microbes that we are, as humans, are not happy to have around and are quite dangerous, or could be potentially quite dangerous to us. So you have bats, say, moving into new areas to find their temperate or Goldilocks zones, and they're encountering new animals. And inevitably, as these animals have encounters, these microbes, these viruses jump through blood and through feces and through other saliva and all kinds of ways from one to the other. And so potentially, as this bat meets this new animal, whether it's a dog or a cow or a cat or whatever, the microbe, the virus makes the jump into this other host, thrives in that host, and then that host brings it to a whole new population, which could include us. And this is the way pandemics are created. And the movement of animals, these new, what they call in Hollywood, meet cutes, right? These sort of rom-com, oh, I didn't know you lived here. Aren't you cute kind of thing. When that happens in the animal world, often there's this transfer of viruses and things like that. And that is the engine that creates and spreads new pandemics.
When I think about the millions of people across the world who died from the most recent pandemic, COVID-19, it's particularly painful for me to know that a significant number of them died preventably. Some of them died because they didn't have accesses to the medical resources they would have needed to save their lives, and others died because they underestimated the risk. They didn't believe in masks or social distancing or in vaccines and what have you. There's no question that disinformation was a driver of a lot of needless deaths from COVID-19. Is that an appropriate comparison to another danger layered upon the one posed by human-made climate change, which is disinformation creating doubt?
So Obama's talking about all of this with the global warming and that, and a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay?
I think that's a very good analogy. The only one difference is that in the pandemic, the disinformation was directly related to the sort of treatment, in the sense of this idea that vaccinations couldn't protect you, the sort of rise of the anti-vax movement. And in here with climate and with heat, it's even more profound and systemic and deeper and bigger than that. Because it's not so much that people have disinformation about what to do when it's hot, although they don't have information because they're not educated about the risks of it at all. But there isn't like a real pipeline of disinformation about what to do on a hot day. The pipeline of disinformation and the reason that people are at risk is because there's been 40 years of a very powerful, very rich, very smart industry telling us and telling people that climate change is not happening, or it's not happening very fast, and we don't need to think about this, and we don't really need to prepare for this because we're not sure if it's real or not. There's still a lot of scientific doubt. So we're just going to continue doing everything the way we used to do it. And that includes building and encouraging people to live in ways that put their lives directly at risk, whether it's building in low areas along the coast that is more and more vulnerable to increased flooding, whether it is in these sort of uninsulated housing that are either unair conditioned or completely dependent upon air conditioning, which can fail. It's about this sort of larger campaign to keep us ignorant about or confuse us or undermine any awareness of these risks that we face. And heat is the most dangerous by far of all of these climate risks. It's the one that kills far more people. For example, hurricanes get a lot of media attention because they're very dramatic. And you see the trees bending in half and the roofs flying, but very few people are the numbers of people who are killed in hurricanes is relatively low given compared to the scale of it. Whereas heat is a brutal killer and it kills very quickly. And when you think about it in the context of human life, the disinformation campaigns that have been waged by the fossil fuel industry and the apathy of the government in responding to these warnings about science is directly responsible, in my view, for these. You cited a figure from Lancet of 419,000 people. I think that's a gross underestimate. I think most people who look at them closely do think that number is a gross underestimate too. But it's also responsible for the individual deaths, I think, of some of the people that I wrote about in a very personal way in my book, like those hikers out on the trail and things. I don't think that you can disassociate the two, right? We live in a world where the awareness of these risks and the dangers that we face have been deliberately and systematically covered, hidden, and confused.
By who?
By the fossil fuel industry. There's a long trail of disinformation from these big companies that have not only put out their own disinformation, it's been well shown that they themselves understood the risks. They did things like raising their drilling platforms and to deal with higher sea level rise, things like that. They took a lot of actions themselves that showed that they understood the risks. And their science has been shown to be really good, the documents that have emerged, that they understood very well what was happening and the dangers of putting CO2 in the atmosphere, but they publicly undermined the science, confused the science. They contributed millions of dollars to politicians who then worked very hard to make sure that no legislation was passed limiting the CO2 emissions, who perpetuated the idea that our economy would be devastated if we dared to switch away from fossil fuels, who undermined public health education around this, who basically failed to warn in a very profound way. And I think when you look around the world right now and you see this rising generation of angry young people, Greta Thunberg is the sort of poster child, but I have 3 kids. I understand what their anger is about this, and I see it broadly around the world of young people thinking that their future has essentially been stolen. And this is what that's about. They understand that these fossil fuel companies have profited billions, trillions of dollars by continuing to drill for and burn and sell this product that is cooking our planet and putting people at risk.
Last week of June and the first half of the first week of July in 2021, the Pacific Northwest was hit with this heat blocking event. Instead of where the average high temperature is normally 78 degrees, they were getting temperatures that were 108 degrees, 112 degrees, 114 degrees, hotter than it had ever been in that area in 125,000 years. And what did that heat do to that community?
That community was not prepared in any way. I've spent a lot of time there. No one in Oregon has any, because there's never been anything like that. They didn't know how to react. It was a terrifying event because most people who lived there were completely unprepared for it. Very few people had air conditioning. There were no kind of resilience hubs, things like that, places where people who didn't have access to cooling spaces could go to. The emergency response people didn't know what to do. They didn't have a plan for it. Here in Texas, we have great plans for hurricanes. Everybody knows what to do on a hurricane comes if you're in Houston. It's everywhere in the media and things like that. There, nobody knew what to do. The media did terrible coverage. They showed kids playing in fountains when they talked about the heat wave coming, and they began in the early days. It was this sort of, oh, this is a good excuse to go to the beach. It's going to be hot in the next couple of weeks. Why don't you pack up the kids and go to the beach, or maybe we'll go to a mountain lake? And it was just, there was no awareness. It hit the area like this sort of invisible force from another planet, really. And it really laid bare our vulnerabilities, especially as humans and other living things. Sadly, tragically, most of all, were humans who were not prepared, who did not have any of the things that you need to survive a heat wave like that, which are access to cooling, awareness of what to do. People went off to go to work in the same ways they did when it was 70 degrees. I wrote about the death of a farm worker in a field in Oregon, and he, even though he was from Guatemala and he knew about heat, he was working in a field, and because at that time there were no worker safety laws for heat, he was afraid that if he asked to take a water break and to sit in the shade for 15 minutes, he was going to be fired. And so he didn't. And because he didn't, he ended up dead. There was no protections in those ways, right? No awareness, no thinking about what we're going to do when a heat wave hits, because no one imagined that a heat wave could hit. And to me, that's emblematic of what's going to be, what our world is going to look increasingly like. It's going to get hotter and hotter in ways that we cannot yet understand. And one of the interesting things I talked about in my book, I thought, was I talked to some of the best scientists in the world about that Pacific Northwest heat wave. And I said, how much hotter could it get? Could we have a 130-degree heat wave in Portland next time? Or for that matter, in Madison, Wisconsin, or another place where it's unusual to have high heat waves? Is there a ceiling to which it can't get any hotter? And basically, the scientists all said no. There's no physical limits. There's no reason why in the summer of 2026, Portland couldn't be hit with a 130-degree heat wave. The scientists would say, you're not going to get a 200 degrees. We're not going to get a giant leap like that. But could we get another 10 degrees? Yes. And when you think about that, when you think about replaying that same event in Portland and adding 5 or 6 or 7 more degrees to it, that would be a kind of American Chernobyl. That would be melting of infrastructure. That would be thousands of deaths, tens of thousands of deaths, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths. That would be catastrophic. And that is the kind of world that we're creating for ourselves right now.
There were at least 1,000 heat-related reported deaths from just that heat wave, and many of the people who died from heat stroke died in their homes.
Yeah.
As you note in the book, in downtown Portland, there were recorded temperatures of 124 degrees Fahrenheit. How long can human beings survive exposure to 124 degrees Fahrenheit?
There's no simple answer to that because it depends on who you are, what kind of condition you're in. Obviously, if you're 75 years old and you have a weak heart, you're not going to survive as long as someone who's 22-year-old marathon runner or something. Depends upon how humid the heat is. The more humid the heat is, the more difficult it is for sweat to dissipate and to cool you off. It depends whether you're in sunlight. There's a lot of factors. It depends on what you're doing, right? If you're sitting versus doing any kind of activity, which generates heat. So it's hard to say in any kind of precise way, but the short answer is not long. One of the things that's really concerning about these rising temperatures is rising nighttime temperatures, because we're much better at dealing with 124 degrees during the day if it drops down to 5 at night or whatever. But increasingly, because of the heating up of the land as opposed to the ocean and the sort of thermal dynamics of our warming world, our nights are staying hotter longer too. So for people who don't have access to cooling, artificial cooling like air conditioning or something, they're sleeping through hotter and hotter nights, which basically gives their bodies no respite and makes those 104 degrees, 24 degrees the next day even more dangerous because their body is already exhausted and the heat is already building up. So there's a lot of uncertainties about our endurance in this, but it's very clear to say that temperatures in that range are extremely dangerous to everyone.
What kind of financial burdens does extreme heat exact upon communities?
When it's hot, you don't want to work. You get your productivity changes in a very clear way. In Mexico, they invented siestas for a reason because it's the middle of the day and it's hot and people don't want to work. So there's been a lot of studies showing big hits on productivity as temperatures rise. And that has large economic consequences when you look at it from a sort of big picture. I talked to a local politician in Houston right now who's very concerned about deaths of outdoor workers during the summer in Houston, which can be brutally hot and also very humid, which makes it even more dangerous. And he basically argued to me that 6 months of the year during the heat season, which in Houston practically is 6 months, they're going to have to shift construction projects to nighttime just in order to get a little bit more cooling because working in the daytime is going to be just too dangerous for everyone. And so when you think about the economic consequences to a growing city like Houston and having to shift all of its construction projects to nighttime, that's just enormous kind of economic change. But I want to point out one other thing parallel to this that I think is really important and that recent studies are showing that people don't think about is there's been a lot of new work on two things. One is children's test scores and school performance during heat. Schools are notoriously poorly air conditioned in many places, especially places like Oregon, where they're not prepared for hot weather. And there's been just this year a number of studies shown a really significant decline in test and school performance when temperatures get. And so, as our planet gets hotter, we're going, it's essentially dumbing down. And of course, it will hit as all this stuff does, the people who are most defenseless first, the kids who have to go to school in unair conditioned or poorly air conditioned schools versus the sort of richer kids who can afford to go to places that have better kind of conditions. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect of it, there's been a lot of really interesting studies coming out, again, just in the last couple of years, is about the link between heat and violence. I think a lot of us intuitively know that. I certainly get more irritated when I'm really hot. If you're stuck in traffic on a hot day, you know that people are honking their horns more and everything. There's been a lot of new work showing violent crimes rising as temperatures rise, domestic abuse rising as temperatures rise. So there's all of these sort of more difficult to quantify aspects of this that go beyond just how many people did this heat wave kill or something like that. It's all of these other consequences. We haven't even talked about food supplies and the rising costs of, everyone's talking about inflation now in their grocery bills. One of the things that is already driving that and is going to drive it way more is when we begin to get more and more significant crop failure because we have these extreme weather conditions, heat being the major one, but also drought, that causes large-scale crop failures, even in places like in the United States, where we're pretty well adapted. I spent a lot of time in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, one of the most agriculturally productive areas in the United States. And you can read the details in the book. They're very concerned there that they're at the edge of their Goldilocks zone. Therefore, a lot of the crops that thrive down there. So as those things begin to fail and heat it is going to influence the economics through that in ways that are very difficult to tease out.
Yeah, you cite in your book a Cornell University study that found that global crop production is 21% lower than it would have been without climate change. If that's true,
Yeah.
how do we feed the world in the coming years?
That's a very good question. One of the things that I talk about when I talk about climate change, and I try to engage people in, I hate the word solutions, but I'll use it here, solutions, and get actively participating in this discussion about how we're going to react to this and deal with this, is that everything, because of our changing climate, heat being the center of it, everything is up for grabs right now. How we generate electricity is changing dramatically. I live in Texas, which is, as everyone knows, hardly tree hugger capital, right? This is the ancestral home of fossil fuels. This is the wildcatters and everything. You know what? Last week, I looked at our generation mix on, of course, Texas has its own grid. It's Texas wood. And on our grid, 70% of the power on our grid was from renewable, from wind and solar last week. I don't know what it is this week, but I'm sure it's close. That's amazing. It's incredible. And so these changes are happening really fast, and they're happening not because these Texans who are building these solar farms and wind turbines are concerned about the fate of the planet, but because the technology is getting better, it's getting cheaper, and they can make a lot more money that way. Things like how we generate energy is up for grabs. Things like kinds of cars that we drive is up for grabs. How we design our cities is going to change in a very profound way. And where we get and how we grow our food and the kinds of things we eat are going to change in a very profound way. The corn belt in Iowa is not sustainable in the climate that we're creating. The Rio Grande Valley in Texas is not sustainable in the kind of climate that we're creating. The Central Valley in California, the apple orchards in Oregon, the vineyards in Oregon and California, none of this stuff is going to be sustainable in this rapidly warming world. So there's going to be major changes. And what those changes are going to be, how that's going to play out, I don't know. There's a lot of really interesting entrepreneurial stuff going on. Everything from lab meat, which is something that's very controversial right now, this cultured meat, things like that, I think are going to become more and more part of our diets. Indoor farming is becoming, I write about that a little bit in my book. There's going to be major changes in our diets, whether we like it or not. And the sort of idea that Americans have of our God-given right to cheap hamburgers and things is going to go away, whether we believe in climate change or not. And one of the pitches I'm trying to make to people is the more actively we get engaged in understanding what we face, the more actively we can begin to make choices and help people, help others, and become an active part of building our world in a better way, using these changes to our advantage, designing cities that are cooler and have more nature in them, more trees, more water, more greenery, building better vehicles, building better urban spaces, living in a more sustainable way than we have.
A lot of presidential politics and politics in our home state of Texas is the politics of immigration. And in your book, you draw a line between human-made extreme heat and drought and the politics of illegal immigration. And it was fascinating. Could you explain that?
It goes back to this idea that climate change is forcing all of us living creatures to move. Migration is a big part of the climate change story because of the idea of seeking this, calling it Goldilocks zone for people and animals, places that have a suitable climate. I mentioned before the idea of frogs climbing higher up the mountains and mosquitoes flying to new areas. Human beings are the same thing. As our planet warms up, as water becomes in certain areas more scarce, as heat becomes more intolerable, as crops begin to fail, there's going to be more and more people in motion looking for safer places, better places to live. It's been the human story since the exodus from Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. And that's going to just be accelerated by these changes that we're talking about. And we're seeing it right now on the Texas border. Obviously, migration and immigration is complex. I'm not arguing that it's all of the people who are crossing the border right now are being driven directly by climate change, but certainly a lot of it is. And as our world becomes more chaotic because of these changes that we've talked about, we're going to see more and more people moving, and more people displaced. And that's one of the sort of big knock-on effects of heat and of climate change that really worries me the most, is because here in Texas, this is what is driving all of our politics. And you can make that argument nationally, basically, that there's no subject that is more central to not only this election year, but to the general discussion of politics in America. The Republicans are saying right now, why are you sending money to Ukraine and not using it to secure our borders? This idea that we need to wall ourselves off and protect from these sort of hordes that are coming in to try to eat our food or take our jobs is the central dynamic in our political discussion right now. And that's just going to be accelerated by these dramatic changes that we are talking about with climate change. And that why I call in my book heat the engine of planetary chaos, because I think one of the subtle and not subtle consequences of this rapidly warming world is a more chaotic world. And a more chaotic world means more movement, more migration, more walls, more fear of others, more of a sense of the sort of dangerous politics of invaders coming in. That sort of big meta dynamic is, to me, the most dangerous thing about this world we're creating by continuing to just dump CO2 into the atmosphere and heat things up.
Thank you to my guest, Jeff Goodell, and thank you for tuning in. Join us next time for the conclusion of my stunning conversation with Jeff, as he explains how gravely climate change threatens human survival and what we must do now and in the future to save ourselves and those we love. This podcast is produced by Shannon McNeese of Revel and Convey and Larry Shavana. The opinions expressed on Outside Counsel are neither legal nor medical advice. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers, guests, experts, and/or host. They do not expressly nor necessarily reflect the opinion of any institution with which I am or ever have been a member and should never be attributed as such. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Outside Counsel. I'm Jeffrey B. Simon.